While investigating an old convent, the millionaire stumbles upon hidden secrets that former nuns have kept for years, truths about chastity that challenge everything he believed in. The auction was nearing its end when Richard Thompson discreetly raised paddle number 42, his eyes as calculating as the numbers he managed daily, fixed on the carved wooden box the auctioneer presented with indifference. The object seemed insignificant compared to the artworks and antiques previously contested, but something about that box captured his attention in a way even he couldn't comprehend. Lot 157, a 19th century document box, unknown origin, likely from the Paraíba Valley region. Starting bid $800, announced the auctioneer unenthusiastically. The others in the grand hall of the Thompson auction house in New York barely glanced up. Richard, however, felt an inexplicable urgency. His bid went uncontested, and minutes later, as he signed the check for what he considered a trivial purchase, he had no idea that box would completely alter the course of his life. Back in his Upper East Side penthouse, Richard observed the box on the marble table in the living room. At 48, the executive had built a pharmaceutical empire from scratch. Thompson Pharmaceuticals ranked among the largest companies in the sector in the United States, with branches across Latin America. Divorced for 5 years and childless, he had turned work into his sole passion. Collecting antiques was merely a hobby to fill rare moments of leisure. He poured himself a whiskey and finally opened the box. Inside revealed a collection of 7 aged notebooks, bound in worn leather, their pages yellowed with time. On the first page of the initial notebook, delicate handwriting formed the name, Sister Mary Cecilia, Hope Convent, 1897. Richard flipped through the diaries with growing curiosity. They were written in archaic Portuguese, filled with religious references and reflections on faith and devotion. Yet as he read further, he realized there was something more between the lines, a disturbing subtext that didn't align with simple notes from a nun. Today marks 3 months since Sister Josephine disappeared. The Mother Superior insists she was transferred to another convent, but why weren't we allowed to say goodbye? And why do her belongings remain untouched in her cell? Last night, I heard screams coming from the basement. No one else seems to notice, or they pretend not to. Richard felt a chill. He continued reading for hours, immersing himself in accounts that grew progressively more unsettling. The author described an isolated convent in the mountains of Appalachia, seemingly dedicated to prayer and contemplation, but where inexplicable events occurred. Young novices who vanished, nighttime visits from unidentified men, and a sickening obsession with feminine purity. Dr. Silverstone came again today. He locked himself in with the Mother Superior for hours. Then, 3 young novices were called to meet with him. They returned pale, silent. None wanted to talk about what happened. Sister Teresa, who was always so talkative, now seems like a shadow of her former self. Among the diaries were also correspondences exchanged with authorities of the time. Politicians, doctors, members of the high society of the United States in the late 19th century. Richard recognized some surnames that still figured among the most powerful families in the country. At dawn, exhausted but electrified by the discovery, Richard made a decision. He needed to find the so-called Hope Convent and uncover what really happened there. It wasn't just curiosity. Something in those pages drew him almost magnetically, as if that story in some way was also his own. A quick search revealed that the convent had indeed existed, located in a mountainous region near Charleston. According to official records, it had been decommissioned in 1912 after a fire. The nuns were relocated to different religious institutions, and the building was abandoned. Richard cancelled all his meetings for the week and summoned Deborah Alvarez, his personal assistant and the only person he fully trusted. "I need you to arrange an immediate trip to Appalachia," he ordered while gathering the diaries. "Is there an issue with the Atlanta branch?" Deborah asked, already taking notes on her tablet. "No, it's something personal. And Deborah, don't include this in my official schedule. No one needs to know where I'm going." The woman nodded, accustomed to her boss's occasional mysteries. As she left to make the arrangements, Richard turned his attention back to the diary. One passage in particular troubled him. "The Baron came today, accompanied by his son. They watched us during prayers as if we were animals on display." Then the young man pointed to Sister Helen. "The next morning she had disappeared. They say she was sent to serve in the Baron's house. But why? Our vows forbid us from leaving the cloister." 3 days later, Richard was driving along a winding road in the mountains of Appalachia. The GPS had lost signal miles ago, and he was relying only on an old map and the coordinates he had managed to extract from references in the journals. The lush landscape of the Appalachian forest contrasted with the growing unease he felt. After hours of travel, he finally spotted the ruins of an imposing structure, partially swallowed by vegetation. What remained of Hope Convent seemed to watch him with empty windows like lifeless orbits. Richard parked the car and contemplated the structure. Even in ruins, the place commanded respect and an inexplicable fear. As he walked toward the main entrance, his phone rang. It was Deborah. "Mr. Thompson, I've discovered something about the convent that you need to know." Her voice sounded urgent. "What?" "That land and the ruins, they belong to the Albuquerque Foundation." Richard felt his blood run cold. The Albuquerque Foundation was one of the oldest and most powerful institutions in the United States, managed by the same family for generations. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, Thompson Pharmaceuticals was negotiating a billion-dollar partnership with the Albuquerque Group for the development of new drugs. "There's more," Deborah continued. "I managed to access some records. The convent wasn't closed because of a fire. There was a secret investigation conducted by the government at the time. All documents were classified and never made public." A figure emerged from among the trees, interrupting the conversation. An elderly woman with gray hair and an upright posture watched Richard with unsettling intensity. "I need to go," Richard murmured into the phone. The woman approached slowly. "I was waiting for someone to come," she said, with a surprisingly steady voice. "After so many years, someone has finally come to seek the truth." "Who are you?" asked Richard, putting away his phone. "My name is Helen Fields," the woman replied, "and 50 years ago I was known as Sister Antonia, from this convent you see before you. Come with me, Mr. Thompson. We have much to discuss." Richard stared at her, stunned. "How do you know my name?" An enigmatic smile appeared on the woman's lips. "I knew your grandfather, Richard, and he had much to do with what happened here." Helen Field's small house was 1/2 kilometer from the ruins of the convent, almost hidden among the vegetation. It was a simple but cozy structure, with a wooden porch that offered a view of the valley. Sitting at the rustic table, Richard watched his hostess prepare an herbal tea while trying to process the information he had just received. "My grandfather never mentioned anything about this place," he said, still incredulous. "How can I be sure you're not confusing people?" Helen placed 2 cups on the table and sat down with the calm of someone who had waited too long to tell a story. "Augustus Thompson, born in 1920 in New York, graduated in medicine, specialized in genetics in Switzerland during the 1940s, and founded what would become the embryo of your pharmaceutical company in 1952. Married Eliza Preston in 1948, had 1 son, your father, Charles Thompson." She paused. "Am I wrong in any detail?" Richard felt a chill. Every detail was correct. "How do you know all this?" "Because your grandfather visited this convent regularly between 1950 and 1962, always on the first Monday of each month, and he always selected some of us for medical examinations." Helen opened a drawer and pulled out an old yellowed photograph, but well preserved. In it, a group of men in suits posed in front of the convent. Richard immediately recognized his grandfather, then young, standing next to figures who, even if he didn't know them personally, were part of the business and political history of the United States. "This is Dr. Augustus Thompson," Helen pointed out. Next to him, Senator Albuquerque, Cardinal Damascene, the industrialist Albert Matarazzo, and the banker Frederick Coimbra. They called themselves the Guardians of Virtue, but to us, they were just our jailers. Richard examined the photograph, looking for any sign of forgery, some proof that this was a trap. But the image was authentic, and his grandfather was unmistakably there, smiling among powerful men in front of the convent that should have meant nothing to his family. There were 47 women when I arrived here in 1957, Helen continued, her eyes lost in painful memories. Some came out of genuine religious calling, but most, like me, were sent by their families to correct inappropriate behavior. In my case, the crime was challenging my father when he decided I would marry a 50-year-old man at 16. The woman took a sip of tea before continuing. The convent was officially run by the church, but secretly controlled by that group of men. They believed in a theory about genetic purity and the superiority of certain lineages. They sought to create an elite that would dominate the United States for generations with specific physical and intellectual traits. Richard shook his head, incredulous. That sounds like eugenics, something completely discredited by modern science. Exactly. But in the 50s and 60s, these theories still had followers, especially among powerful men who wanted to scientifically justify their supposed superiority. Helen sighed. Your grandfather wasn't a fanatic like the others. He was a scientist genuinely interested in genetics, but he crossed every ethical line in the name of research. What did they do to you? We were constantly examined, our physical and mental traits catalogued. They conducted intelligence tests, collected blood samples. Some women were selected and taken to a wing called the Purification Wing. They would be isolated for weeks or months. When they returned, they were different. Some seemed empty inside. Richard felt nauseous imagining what might have happened in that purification wing. His pharmaceutical company, which now developed life-saving drugs, could it have started as a laboratory for unethical experiments? And what happened? How was the convent closed? Helen stood up and walked to the window. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the distant ruins of the convent. In 1962, one of us, Sister Concepta, managed to send a letter exposing the abuses. The correspondence reached the hands of a young prosecutor in Atlanta. When he began to investigate, the guardians acted quickly. The convent was officially closed, citing structural issues with the building. We were all separated and sent to different convents across the country, and the investigation was silenced. The woman sat back down, facing Richard. But what they didn't know is that many of us had already planned our own escape. We had collected evidence, written diaries like the ones you found. We made copies and hid them in different places. In the following years, some managed to leave religious life. We created a network of mutual support, always vigilant, always afraid that they would find us. And did they? Helen's gaze hardened. 3 of ours were victims during the 70s. Convenient accidents. One hit by an unmarked car. Another suffered a fatal allergic reaction to a medication she had taken for years without issues. The third fell from the 4th floor of a building while washing windows. Richard swallowed hard. Are you suggesting that my grandfather... I'm not accusing anyone specifically, Helen interrupted. But the guardians had reach and influence, and they silenced anyone who posed a threat. She stood up again, this time walking over to a small bookshelf. She pulled out a box similar to the one Richard had bought at the auction and opened it, revealing more journals and documents. For decades we kept silent, waiting for the right moment. We watched the children and grandchildren of the guardians take positions of power in the country. A new generation continuing the legacy without even knowing its true origin. Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't you go to the authorities? Helen smiled sadly. We tried in the past, twice. The cases simply vanished from the courts. As for why now, it's because you came to me. You found the journals and followed the clues here. That means you're ready to hear the truth, even if it shatters the image you have of your family. Richard stood up, restless, pacing around the small room. I need concrete evidence, something that can be independently verified. Helen nodded. Come with me tomorrow to the convent. There's something I need to show you in the basement. Something the guardians couldn't destroy when they hastily closed the place down. That night, staying at the only inn in the nearby small town, Richard couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, thinking about his grandfather, the man he had always admired, the visionary who had built the empire he now led. Could it be possible that all that wealth, The entire Thompson legacy was tainted by inhumane experiments. His phone rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Deborah again. "Mr. Thompson, I apologize for calling so late, but I've discovered something strange. Someone accessed your private files at the company today using your login." "Impossible. I have my phone and laptop right here." "Exactly. That's why I'm concerned. Also, I received a call from Dr. Albuquerque asking about your trip. He seemed eager to know your exact location." Richard felt a chill. Edward Albuquerque was the current president of the Albuquerque Foundation and the lead negotiator for the commercial partnership they were finalizing. "Don't tell him anything. And Deborah, be ready to receive some documents I'll send tomorrow. Make digital and physical copies and store them in secure locations." "Sir, is everything all right? You seem worried." "I'm not sure." Richard looked out the window into the dark Appalachian night. "But I'll know more tomorrow." The next morning, promptly at 8 a.m., Richard parked his car near Helen's house. The door was slightly ajar, which immediately raised an alarm. He called out a few times and, receiving no response, cautiously entered. The house was turned upside down as if a hurricane had swept through. Drawers were open, papers were scattered, and furniture was out of place. There was no sign of Helen. On the kitchen table, one object caught his attention. The box of documents she had shown him the night before was there, untouched. Next to it, a hastily written note. "Convent. Basement. East panel, 1962. Richard picked up the box and the note, feeling the weight of responsibility and fear. What had happened to Helen? Who had ransacked her home? And what would he find in the convent's basement? Looking again at the ruins in the distance, Richard made a choice. He couldn't turn back now. If his grandfather had truly been involved in those events, if his family's fortune was built on suffering, he needed to know. And more than that, he needed to decide what he would do with that truth. He placed the box in the car and headed to the convent, aware that each step brought him closer not only to his family's dark past, but also to a danger that felt very present and real. The interior of the convent was plunged into a damp gloom. Richard walked cautiously through the halls, avoiding loose floorboards and dodging fallen beams. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds that had nested in the broken windows. Helen's note mentioned the basement and an east panel, but finding the entrance wasn't easy. After nearly an hour exploring the first floor, Richard located a door partially blocked by debris. He cleared the rubble with difficulty, revealing a spiral stone staircase descending into darkness. Using his phone's flashlight, he began the descent. The steps, worn by time, demanded extra caution. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a vast underground hall. The air was thick with mold and dampness. The stone walls, covered in moss, seemed to hold secrets from centuries past. "East panel," Richard murmured, orienting himself. The hall had 4 walls, each with various carved wooden panels. He approached the eastern wall and examined the panels one by one. The 5th panel caught his attention. Unlike the others, it didn't feature religious imagery, but an intricate, geometric pattern. At its center, almost imperceptible, was a small inverted cross. Richard pressed it, hoping something would happen. Nothing. Frustrated, he examined the note again. 1962. Could it be a password? A code? He looked back at the panel and noticed small numbers etched into the geometric pattern. He pressed the numbers in sequence, 19 to 62. A metallic click echoed through the hall. The panel slid to the side, revealing a hidden chamber. Richard took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was surprisingly well preserved, a small space, with metal shelves filled with folders and documents organized chronologically. In the center stood a medical examination table with outdated equipment. On the walls were photographs of women, all wearing religious habits, with identification, numbers and marginal notes. Richard approached the shelves and picked up a random folder. It contained detailed profiles of women, with physical data, psychological test results, and more disturbingly, notes on reproductive potential and genetic compatibility. Another folder revealed correspondence among the guardians of virtue. In a 1958 letter, his grandfather wrote to Senator Albuquerque, "The experiments are progressing satisfactorily. Subjects 17, 23, and 29 have displayed the genetic markers we seek. I recommend they be removed from the chastity program and introduced to Protocol B. The Cardinal will arrange the necessary documentation to formalize their dispensation from vows." Richard felt nauseous. Protocol B. What did that mean? He continued examining the documents, each revelation more disturbing than the last. He found birth records, all from private clinics run by the Albuquerque Foundation, all with mothers, identified only by numbers. In another drawer, he discovered his grandfather's scientific journal, detailing medical procedures performed without consent, including forced inseminations and experimental surgeries. The project had a name, Pure Lineage. A more recent folder caught his attention. Unlike the others, which seemed meticulously organized, this one was placed on the table, as if someone had consulted it recently. Inside, he found lists of names, people, born between 1958 and 1962, all with the same notation, Alpha Generation. Shocked, Richard found his own name on the list. Next to it, a note indicated Primary Lineage, Maximum Potential. Impressive, isn't it? The voice made Richard turn abruptly. At the entrance of the secret chamber stood Edward Albuquerque, impeccably dressed in a grey suit, incongruous with the decaying surroundings. Beside him, a burly man held Helen by the arms. The elderly woman looked frightened, but determined. "Dr. Albuquerque," said Richard, trying to remain calm, "I didn't expect to find you here, nor did I expect to have to come personally, but certain situations require the presence of a guardian." Edward entered the room, looking around with familiarity. "I see you've already discovered your family's great secret. Your grandfather was a visionary." "A criminal, you mean?" Richard retorted. "Human experimentation without consent. Forced, genetic manipulation." Edward smiled condescendingly. A limited view typical of this generation that doesn't understand necessary sacrifices. The Pure Lineage project created the elite that commands the United States today. Look at yourself. Superior, intelligence, perfect health, innate leadership ability. It's no coincidence. Richard processed the information, trying not to show the horror he felt. "I'm on that list. What does it mean?" "It means, my dear, that you are the product of decades of careful genetic planning. Your DNA was meticulously selected to create the perfect leader for the new phase of the project." Helen, still held by the security guard, spoke in a trembling voice. "Tell him the whole truth, Edward. Tell him who his mother was." Albuquerque's face hardened. "Shut up, old woman. You've already caused enough trouble." Richard instinctively moved closer to Helen, but stopped when the guard drew a gun. "My mother died in an accident when I was 5. What does she have to do with this?" Helen replied before Edward could stop her. "Eliza Thompson wasn't your biological mother, Richard. She couldn't have children. Your real mother was one of the women from this convent, chosen by the E. Programmed for her superior genetic profile, inseminated with selected sperm, and then discarded." Richard felt the world spinning around him. "Impossible." "Subject 29, Helen continued. "That was her number. Her real name was Beatrice Fontaine, a brilliant young woman, a medical student, sent to the convent by her family when they found out she was in a relationship with a college classmate." Edward stepped forward, irritated. "Enough of this sentimental story, Richard. You need to understand the magnitude of what's at stake. The project didn't end with the closure of this convent. It evolved, adapted to the new times, and now we need you for the next phase, which would be the partnership between Thompson Pharmaceuticals and the Albuquerque Foundation. It's not just a business, it's the continuation of the project under a modern and acceptable facade. Your research in gene therapy, combined with our genealogical database, will allow us to resume the experiments discreetly and with scientific advancement." Richard looked at the documents in his hands, then at Helen and finally at Edward. "What if I refuse?" Edward smiled coldly. That's not an option. You were created for this purpose. It's in your DNA. And if you still need a more pragmatic incentive, remember that your company depends on investments and approvals controlled by people in our network. At that moment, a noise from the stairs interrupted the conversation. Deborah Alvarez appeared at the entrance, breathless. "Mr. Thompson? Thank God I found you. I've been trying to call, but there's no signal down here." She paused, confused by the scene. Edward quickly regained his composure. "Miss Alvarez, what a surprise. I didn't expect to see you so far from New York." "I came because I found something you need to see urgently," Deborah replied, handing Richard an envelope. "Documents about the true shareholder structure of Thompson Pharmaceuticals. It seems that 30% of the shares are in funds controlled by the Albuquerque Foundation, acquired discreetly over the last 5 years." Richard opened the envelope, confirming the information. His empire was being silently taken over. Edward clapped sarcastically. "Efficient, your assistant. But this only confirms what I'm saying. You never had a choice, Richard. The game was set long before you were even born." Richard felt a rising anger, but remained calm. "I needed time to think." "Let's talk then. But first, release Mrs. Helen." Edward gestured to the security guard who let the elderly woman go. Helen approached Richard, her eyes conveying something he couldn't quite decipher. "I'll show you what else I found here," Helen said, walking toward what appeared to be an ordinary bookshelf. She pressed a sequence of books, and a hidden compartment opened on the opposite wall. "This," she announced, pulling out a metal box, "is what Augustus Thompson hid from you. The real reason the project was halted in 1962. Edward stepped forward, visibly shaken. "What are you talking about? Hand that over immediately." Helen opened the box, revealing a set of microfilms and a journal bearing the seal of Thompson Pharmaceuticals. "Your grandfather had a conscience, Richard, unlike these other monsters. When he realized the ethical implications of what they were doing, he began documenting everything in secret. He planned to expose the scheme, but the other Guardians found out." Edward tried to move forward, but Richard stepped between him and Helen. "The accident that killed your father in 1963 was no accident," Helen continued. "It was punishment for his betrayal, and the death of your mother, Beatrice, the woman who actually gave birth to you, was also orchestrated by them." "Lies!" Edward shouted, losing his composure. "Dr. Augustus died of natural causes years later. The man you knew as Augustus Thompson after 1963 was a replacement," Helen revealed, handing Richard a photograph. "Compare it to the images you have of your grandfather." Richard examined the photo and felt a chill. The man he had always known as his grandfather had subtle physical differences compared to the man in the older photograph. "Impossible," he murmured. "The project was bigger than any of us imagined," said Helen, "but they never counted on one thing, that some of us would survive to tell the truth, and that Augustus's grandson, the most perfect product of the program, could be the man to finally expose it." Edward signaled to the security guard, who stepped forward with his weapon drawn. "Enough of this farce. Take the documents and eliminate the 3 of them." At that moment, police sirens echoed from outside the convent. "Too late," Deborah smiled, holding up her phone. "Live stream to the federal police, and copies of all the documents are already in safe hands." Edward's face twisted in anger, but he quickly regained his composure. "This isn't over. The network of the Guardians goes far beyond what you can. Imagine, politicians, judges, businessmen, you may win a battle, but the war is ours." Richard stepped forward, staring Edward down. "I'm willing to take the risk. Some secrets need to come to light no matter the cost." As the voices of the police officers grew closer, Richard realized his life would never be the same. The revelations from that basement had not only shattered his understanding of his past, but had also completely altered his future. What would he do with the truth about his origins? How would he confront the empire built on so much suffering? And most importantly, would he be able to dismantle a conspiracy so deeply rooted in the country's power structures? He looked at Helen, the woman who had survived decades guarding that truth, and at Deborah, whose loyalty had proven stronger than any threat. With them by his side, perhaps he stood a chance against the ghosts of the past and the enemies of the present. 3 weeks had passed since the discoveries in the convent's basement. Richard watched the sunset from the window of his penthouse in New York, the city that never slept sprawling at his feet, oblivious to the secrets he now carried. The coffee table was covered with documents, some originals recovered from the convent, others copies made by Deborah before the official investigation began. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Helen entered, looking more cheerful than when he had first met her. Staying in one of Richard's apartments, the former nun had become his advisor and a living link to a past he was still trying to understand. "Any news?" she asked, sitting on the sofa. "Edward Albuquerque remains detained, but the family has hired the best lawyers in the country. The charges are serious: kidnapping, document forgery, attempted murder, but he has powerful connections." Helen nodded, unsurprised. "What about the others?" The security guard confessed, implicating several people from the Albuquerque Foundation. "But we still don't have enough evidence on everyone involved in the current network of the Guardians of Virtue." Richard sat down beside her. "The investigation into the old archives is progressing slowly. Many of the women mentioned in the records have already passed away, and others don't want to relive the trauma." The intercom buzzed. Deborah arrived, accompanied by Dr. Louisa. Camargo, the geneticist Richard had hired to analyze the material they had found. "I have the results you asked for," announced Louisa, placing a folder on the table. "And I must say they are fascinating from a scientific standpoint, disturbing from an ethical one." Richard opened the folder. Inside were detailed reports and genetic analyses. "The DNA samples found in the convent's laboratory confirm what we suspected," the geneticist explained. "The Pure Lineage project used rudimentary genetic selection techniques by today's standards, but advanced for their time. They identified specific markers associated with intelligence, longevity, and other traits considered desirable." "What about my DNA?" asked Richard. Louisa hesitated. "The comparison confirms that you are not the biological son of Charles and Eliza Thompson. Your genetic profile is compatible with the sample labeled Subject 29, presumably Beatrice Fontaine." Richard had suspected as much, but the scientific confirmation hit him like a physical blow. His entire identity built on a lie. "There's more," Louisa continued. "We found a peculiarity in your genetic code, a sequence that isn't natural, even by the standards of the time." "What does that mean?" "It means your grandfather, or whoever was conducting the experiments, managed to genetically modify human embryos as early as the 1960s, something that was officially only achieved decades later." Silence filled the room as everyone processed the information. "This explains the Albuquerque Foundation's interest in your company," Deborah commented. "Thompson Pharmaceuticals became a leader in genetic research. They wanted access to your advanced techniques to revive the original project." Richard stood up, restless. "The partnership we were negotiating included access to our gene therapy research labs. With that, and the genealogical records the Foundation maintains, they could identify all descendants of the original project and God knows what they'd do next." "That's not all," Deborah said, opening her laptop. "I cross-referenced the names on the Alpha Generation list with our national corporate database. 27 of the 42 names now hold positions of extreme power: CEOs of major companies, influential politicians, Supreme Court justices." Helen shook her head, sad but not surprised. "The Guardians were planning for the future. They created a network of influence that persists to this day, even without many of these project children knowing their origins." Richard examined the list again, recognizing several names. People he had negotiated with, competed against, even formed relationships with, all apparently products of the same experiment that had created him. "And now, what do we do with this information?" Deborah hesitated before answering. "The matter is delicate. Exposing everything publicly would affect innocent people, who are not to blame for how they were conceived. Moreover, the reaction of society would be unpredictable. We could trigger institutional chaos in the country. Not to mention the personal risks, added Helen. The Guardians still have powerful allies. Edward may be detained, but he's not the only one. Richard walked to the window, gazing at the city that now seemed strangely different, a setting where a silent conspiracy had been operating for decades. I need more information before deciding our next move, he finally said. I want to find Beatrice Fontaine, or discover what happened to her. I've already started that search, Deborah informed. I found records of a Beatrice Fontaine admitted to a psychiatric clinic in Asheville in 1968. The clinic still exists now as a rehabilitation center. Asheville, murmured Helen. That makes sense. The Albuquerque family had properties there. I'll go to Asheville tomorrow, Richard decided. That night, alone once more, Richard revisited the diaries of Sister Mary Cecilia, the nun whose notes had started this entire journey. A specific passage caught his attention. Today I learned that Sister Helen discovered the truth about Dr. Augustus. She found the documents he had hidden in the laboratory, including letters to his wife, where he confessed his plans to expose the project. The doctor is not like the others. I see remorse in his eyes when he examines the young women. He started something terrible, but now he wishes to end it. I fear for his life when the others discover his betrayal. Richard felt an unexpected connection to the grandfather he had never known, not the imposter who had assumed his identity, but the true Augustus Thompson, the man who, even belatedly, had tried to right his wrongs. The phone rang, interrupting his reflection. It was an unknown number. Mr. Thompson. The voice on the other end was deep and controlled. My name is Father Thomas Damascene. I believe we need to talk. About what exactly? About your grandfather, about Hope Convent, and about what you intend to do with the information you've uncovered. Richard felt his heart race. How do you know what I've discovered? I've been monitoring your investigation from the beginning. I am the grandnephew of Cardinal Damascene, one of the founders of the Guardians of Virtue. So you're one of them, Richard concluded, tense. No, the reply was firm. I am part of another group, formed decades ago to counter the actions of the Guardians. We call ourselves the Sentinels of Truth. For generations, we have worked in the shadows to dismantle the network they created. Why should I believe you? Because I was the one who ensured that Sister Mary Cecilia's diaries appeared at that auction precisely when we knew you would be there. Richard fell silent, processing the information. I need to find Beatrice Fontaine, he finally said. I know where she is, replied the priest, and I can take you to her, but you must understand that opening this door will put you in even greater danger. I have no choice. She is my biological mother. Then we will meet tomorrow, not in Asheville. That is a false trail we planted. Beatrice is in Savannah, protected by our network for nearly 4 decades. The next day, Richard drove along the winding road of the Appalachian Forest toward Savannah, the historic colonial city on the coast. He had instructed Deborah not to share her fate with anyone and left Helen in New York, protected by private security. Father Thomas was waiting for him in the central square, near the old parish church. He was a middle-aged man with keen eyes and a serene expression. She's eager to meet you, the priest said as they walked along the cobblestone streets. Beatrice never lost hope of one day finding the son who was taken from her. Does she know who I am? She knows everything about you. She followed your life from afar through the news, always proud, always wishing to get closer but never daring to, fearing it might draw unwanted attention to both of you. They arrived at a well-preserved colonial house overlooking the sea. In the small garden, a grey-haired lady was painting on a canvas. When she turned around, Richard saw his own eyes, reflected in her face. "Richard," she said simply, her voice choked with emotion. He felt a lump in his throat, unable to respond. All the speeches he had rehearsed in his mind during the journey seemed inadequate in the face of the reality of that moment. Beatrice approached slowly, examining every detail of his face. "You have your grandfather's eyes," she finally said, gently touching his face, "the true Augustus Thompson." Richard felt tears he couldn't control. So many questions, so many repressed emotions, all overflowing in that instant. "Why did you never look for me?" he finally managed to ask. Beatrice led him to a bench under a leafy tree. "I tried at first, but they found me quickly. I was declared mentally unstable, forcibly institutionalized. When I finally managed to escape, with the help of Father Thomas's group, you were already integrated into the Thompson family. I was just a threat to your safety." What really happened at the convent? Beatrice took a deep breath, preparing to relive painful memories. "I was sent there in 1966. When I was 19 years old, my family was traditional and didn't accept it when they discovered my sexual orientation. The convent was considered a place to correct wayward young women." She paused, her eyes lost in memories. "Quickly, I realized that it wasn't a real convent. The nuns were mostly young women like me, sent there against their will, and the medical exams were invasive, degrading. Augustus Thompson conducted many of them, but I noticed that unlike the other doctors, he seemed uncomfortable, almost guilty. One day, he called me aside and confessed everything: the Pure Lineage Project, the genetic experiments, his plan to expose the scheme. He asked for my help to document what was happening there. For months we worked together, gathering evidence." "Then they found out?" Beatrice nodded sadly. "In March 1967, Augustus disappeared. They said he had been transferred, but I knew the truth. Weeks later, I was placed in the special program, forcibly inseminated with selected genetic material. 9 months later, you were born." Richard felt a wave of nausea. "And then they took me away from you. Immediately after birth, they didn't even let me see you. I was transferred to the psychiatric clinic, where they kept me drugged for months until Helen and other women from the underground network helped me escape." Father Thomas, who had been silently observing the conversation, stepped forward. "What Beatrice isn't saying is that after escaping, she became one of the leaders of our organization. Even in hiding, she helped save dozens of other women and protect their children from the influence of the Guardians." Beatrice smiled timidly. "I did what I could to honor Augustus's memory and his sacrifice." "What happened to the real Augustus Thompson?" asked Richard. A heavy silence followed his question. Beatrice and the priest exchanged glances. "He wasn't eliminated immediately," the priest finally replied. "He was kept prisoner for almost a year, forced to train his replacement, a man surgically altered to look like him. They needed the transition to be perfect for no one to suspect. And then, officially, he suffered a heart attack while on a spiritual retreat. In reality..." The priest stopped, interrupted by the sound of an engine rapidly approaching. 3 black SUVs screeched to a halt in front of the house. "They've found us," said the priest, alarmed. "We need to leave now." Richard stood up, instinctively positioning himself between his biological mother and the approaching threat. "Who are they?" "The operational division of the Guardians," Beatrice explained, quickly heading inside the house. "Not all members of the network are public figures. Some do the dirty work." Men in formal attire but with a distinctly military posture approached the entrance. Richard recognized one of them, Gustav Matarazzo, a top executive at a media conglomerate, and the son of one of the original Guardians. Father Thomas led them to the back of the house, where a passage led to a private dock. A boat was waiting, engine already running. "We have a safe refuge on a nearby island," the priest explained. "We'll be protected there until we decide on the next move." Richard hesitated. "What about Deborah and Helen? They might go after them." "They've already been warned," the priest assured him. "Our network is active. They are being taken to safe locations at this moment." As they boarded, Richard looked back, seeing Matarazzo's men breaking into the house. His world was crumbling, but for the first time in weeks he felt strangely at peace. By the side of his true mother, following in the footsteps of the grandfather who had tried to right his wrongs, he finally knew which side of history he wanted to be on. The boat accelerated, cutting through the calm waters of Savannah Bay, moving away from the historic town and the men who represented a past of abuse and manipulation. Ahead, through the morning mist, A small island emerged, a temporary refuge where they could plan their counter-offensive. The battle for truth had only just begun, and Richard Thompson, the most perfect product of the Pure Lineage project, would now become the greatest threat to the continuation of that dark legacy. St. John's Island emerged from the morning mist like a natural fortress. Surrounded by turquoise waters and protected by steep cliffs, its only accessible beach was guarded by a discreet but efficient security system. Richard disembarked alongside Beatrice and Father Thomas, observing the simple yet elegant house built on the hillside, partially hidden by lush vegetation. "Welcome to our headquarters," said the priest as they walked along the stone path. "This island officially belongs to a conservation foundation. In reality, it has been the operational center of the Sentinels of Truth for nearly 3 decades. As they approached the house, Richard saw familiar faces waiting. Helen and Deborah were on the porch, safe. There were also others he didn't know, all with the same look of determination in their eyes. "We made it here before them," Deborah remarked, embracing her boss. "Your home and office are being watched. Thompson Pharmaceuticals is in an uproar over your disappearance." "And Edward Albuquerque?" Richard asked. "Released this morning. $1 million bail paid by the foundation. His connections in the judiciary worked." Richard wasn't surprised. The system was infiltrated, as Helen had always warned. Inside the house, in the spacious room overlooking the sea, a map of the United States covered an entire wall, marked with colored dots and lines connecting different locations. On the opposite wall, hundreds of photographs arranged chronologically showed the quiet work of the Sentinels over decades. "Each red dot on the map represents a current facility of the Guardians," explained a woman in her 60s, who introduced herself as Dr. Clara Oliveira, a neuroscientist and member of the Sentinels for 20 years. Clinics for treatment, research centers, spiritual retreats, all facades for the continuation of the Pure Lineage project. "The most alarming part is this," she continued, pointing to a region in the interior of Montana. "A facility built in the last 5 years, isolated with maximum security. We believe it to be the new center of the project, now equipped with cutting-edge genetic editing techniques." "How did you gather all this information?" asked Richard, impressed. "The same way your grandfather did, from the inside," replied Father Thomas. "We have people infiltrated at every level of the organization. Some are repentant descendants of the original project. Others are scientists who discovered the truth and refused to participate." Richard examined the map, trying to grasp the magnitude of the operation. "If all of this is true, why haven't you taken the evidence to the authorities?" Helen stepped forward. "We've tried multiple times. In 1985, we gathered enough evidence to initiate a federal investigation. The prosecutor assigned to the case was found dead in his apartment before he could file the charges. In 1998, an investigative journalist was about to publish a series of reports. His car suffered a mysterious brake failure. In 2007, an Allied senator received our complete dossier. A week later, he resigned from office and moved abroad, never mentioning the matter again." Richard felt the weight of the conspiracy they were up against. This wasn't just a criminal organization, but a power structure deeply rooted in the country's institutions. "What's the plan now?" he asked. Clara pointed to documents spread across the central table. "We're monitoring the network's movements. With Edward free, they'll try to accelerate their plans. The partnership with his company was crucial. Without it, they'll need an alternative to access cutting-edge genetic technology. We believe they'll attempt a direct approach to the final phase of the project," added Father Thomas, "identifying all descendants of the Alpha generation, those unaware of their origins, and recruiting them in some way." "For what purpose?" Richard questioned. Beatrice, who had been silent until then, replied, "For what has always been the ultimate goal of the Guardians, to redesign American society from the top down. A genetically enhanced elite occupying key positions, a form of social control based not on brute force, but on genetic influence." Deborah, who had been analyzing data on her laptop, interrupted the conversation. "We have a more immediate problem. I just received information from our source on the administrative board of Thompson Pharmaceuticals. An emergency meeting has been called for tomorrow, with only one item on the agenda: your temporary replacement due to psychological incapacity. They can't do that, protested Richard. They can with the shares they secretly control and a forged medical declaration. The proposed replacement is Victor Coimbra, grandson of Frederick Coimbra, one of the original Guardians. Richard felt the trap closing. They weren't just trying to neutralize him, but also to take direct control of his company and consequently his research in gene therapy. I need to return to New York immediately, he decided. Father Thomas shook his head. That would be extremely risky. They're waiting for you. That's exactly why I must go. If I disappear now, I'll only confirm their suspicions about my instability. I need to confront them directly, on their own terms. Everyone in the room seemed concerned about the decision, but understood the logic. The silence was broken by Beatrice. He's right, Richard is the centerpiece now. As long as they're focused on him, we have an opportunity to act on other fronts. A strategy began to take shape. Richard would face the administrative board in New York, buying time and attention, while the Sentinels mobilized their resources to expose the Guardian's network on multiple fronts simultaneously. We have contacts in international media outlets, explained Clara. If we send the evidence to multiple foreign journalists at the same time, it will be harder for them to suppress the story. And I have access to all the company's servers, Deborah added. I can create an automatic document release protocol if something happens to any of us. Over the next few hours, the plan was refined. Richard would leave the following morning, seemingly alone, but secretly protected by a network of allies. The Sentinels of Truth would launch their counter-offensive 24 hours later, giving Richard enough time to position himself. When the meeting ended, he finally found himself alone with Beatrice on the deck overlooking the calm waters. The sun was setting on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. I have so many questions, he said, so many things I wish I could recover. Beatrice smiled with that mix of sadness and hope that seemed to define her. We'll have time, Richard. When all this is over, we'll have all the time in the world to truly get to know each other. What if we don't succeed? What if they're too strong? Your grandfather, the real Augustus, used to say that the truth has a strength of its own independent of who defends it. Once planted, it grows even in the most adverse conditions. Richard gazed at the horizon, thinking about all the twists and turns his life had taken in recent weeks. Why do you think he changed? Why did he decide to turn against the very project he helped create? Beatrice reflected for a moment. I think it was a gradual realization. He started out believing he was making important scientific advances, that the ends justified the means. But when he saw the real consequences in the lives of women like me, when he understood that we were creating a sophisticated form of social control, something inside him awakened. She paused, looking directly into Richard's eyes. Do you know what he told me the last time we met? That seeing how the women in the convent were treated reminded him of his own mother, your grandmother, who had been silenced and controlled her entire life by an authoritarian husband. I'm perpetuating the same system my mother silently fought against, he confessed. Richard felt a deep connection to the man he had never met, but whose blood and apparently whose conscience also ran through his veins. Tomorrow, when you stand before them, remember, you are not alone in this fight, said Beatrice, holding his hand. You carry the legacy of your grandfather's redemption, the resilience of all of us who survived, and the hope for a future where no one else is manipulated as we were. The next morning, a helicopter took Richard back to New York. During the flight, he video-called his legal team preparing for the battle ahead. As he landed on the helipad at Thompson Pharmaceuticals, he felt the tension in the air. Employees watched him with curiosity and concern as he walked through the halls. The boardroom was full when he entered. Surprised faces turned toward him. Clearly they hadn't expected his presence. Victor Coimbra, seated at the far end of the table, couldn't hide his displeasure. Richard, what a pleasant surprise, Victor said, forcing a smile. We were worried about your disappearance. I imagine you were, Richard replied calmly, taking his seat at the head of the table. So worried that you've already prepared documents to declare me mentally unfit to lead the company. Murmurs rippled through the room. Some board members had the decency to look embarrassed. It's just a precautionary measure, Victor explained. Your recent behavior has been erratic. Richard smiled, opening his briefcase. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, before we begin this meeting, I'd like to present some documents that may completely alter today's agenda. He handed each member a folder containing partial copies of the documents found at the convent, carefully selected, to reveal the existence of the Pure Lineage project without fully exposing the conspiracy, a calculated bait. As you can, see, I've recently uncovered disturbing information about the origins of Thompson Pharmaceuticals, information suggesting that my grandfather, or someone using his identity, was involved in unethical genetic manipulation experiments in the 1950s and 60s. Victor's face visibly paled. These accusations are absurd, based on documents of questionable authenticity. Their authenticity will be easily verified through forensic analysis, Richard countered. More importantly, I've discovered that external entities have been secretly acquiring shares of our company in an apparent attempt to control our genetic therapy research. He paused dramatically, observing the reactions of the board members. Some seemed genuinely shocked, others visibly uncomfortable. Gentlemen, I did not come here to be dismissed, but to propose an independent investigation into these matters. If it is confirmed that Thompson Pharmaceuticals was born from unethical practices, I have a moral duty, we all do, to correct these mistakes and compensate potential victims. The room fell into absolute silence. Victor Coimbra seemed to weigh his options while the other board members processed the explosive information. What exactly are you suggesting? Asked Dr. Carmen Vasquez, one of the most respected advisors, finally breaking the silence. I propose the formation of an independent committee composed of experts in ethics, medical history, and human rights to investigate these allegations. In the meantime, I suggest freezing all strategic partnership negotiations, especially with the Albuquerque Foundation. Victor stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. We cannot halt the company's business based on conspiracy theories. If there is nothing to hide, why fear a transparent investigation? Richard calmly questioned. The meeting turned into a heated debate. In the end, by a narrow margin, the board approved Richard's proposal. An independent committee would be formed, and negotiations with the Albuquerque Foundation were temporarily suspended. As he left the meeting room, Richard received an encrypted message from Deborah. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 initiating in T6 hours. Exactly 6 hours later, while Richard was participating in a press conference explaining the board's decision, the counteroffensive of the Sentinels of Truth began on multiple fronts. In Washington, Brussels, Geneva, and Tokyo, journalists from international outlets simultaneously received packages containing documents detailing the Pure Lineage project and its contemporary ramifications. In the United States, 3 federal prosecutors from different states, previously contacted by the Sentinels, announced the opening of investigations based on evidence received anonymously. On social media, hundreds of testimonies from women, survivors of institutions controlled by the Guardians of Virtue, began to surface, coordinated by Helen and her support network. And on the dark web, a hacktivist group allied with the Sentinels released thousands of emails and internal documents from the Albuquerque Foundation. The reaction was immediate. Edward Albuquerque called an emergency press conference to deny all allegations, labeling them as a defamatory campaign orchestrated by jealous competitors. However, his facade of calm crumbled when an international reporter presented copies of emails where he explicitly discussed the continuation of the original project with other members of the network. At Thompson Pharmaceuticals headquarters, Richard watched everything unfold through the television screens in his office. Deborah entered, breathless. It worked. The story is too big to be suppressed. It's already in all the major international outlets. And the Guardians? Collapsing. They're turning on each other. Edward Albuquerque just accused Victor Coimbra of leaking information. Cardinal Montenegro, from the conservative wing of the church, announced his resignation for health reasons, and at least 3 directors of major companies tied to the network have taken leave from their positions. Richard allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction, but he knew the battle was just beginning. And the facility in Montana? Federal agents are on their way based on anonymous tips. We have people monitoring to ensure nothing is destroyed before they arrive. In the weeks that followed, the conspiracy of the Guardians of Virtue dominated national and international news. Investigations were opened on multiple fronts: police, parliamentary, journalistic. Years of secrets came to light, revealing a web of manipulation that spanned decades and affected hundreds of lives. 6 months later, Richard watched the sunset from the balcony of Beatrice's house in Savannah, now his weekend refuge. After the initial whirlwind, things were beginning to find a new balance. Thompson Pharmaceuticals had been completely restructured. Richard remained CEO, but had created an independent foundation controlled by survivors of the project and ethics experts to oversee all of the company's research. A significant portion of profits was now allocated to reparations for identified victims and their descendants. Edward Albuquerque, Victor Coimbra, and 3 other leaders of the modern Guardians were facing criminal charges. Some of the younger members of the network had agreed to cooperate with the investigations in exchange for immunity. The facility in Montana had been shut down, freeing dozens of women kept in conditions similar to those of the old convent. "Thinking about the future?" asked Beatrice, joining him on the balcony. "About the past, actually," replied Richard. "About how it all began, the choices people made, and how these choices affected so many lives for so long." Beatrice nodded, understanding. "The power of truth is transformative, but now we have a responsibility to that truth. It's not enough to expose evil. We must build something better in its place." Richard agreed. Thompson Pharmaceuticals was now at the forefront of ethical medicine, developing accessible gene therapies for rare diseases with consent protocols that set new standards for the industry. The Sentinels of Truth, now operating openly as an NGO dedicated to scientific transparency, worked with international bodies to prevent similar abuses globally. "You know what surprised me the most in all of this?" reflected Richard. "It wasn't the conspiracy itself, but how people can be manipulated into doing terrible things while believing they're doing good. The Guardians genuinely believed they were improving humanity. That's why ethical vigilance can never cease," replied Beatrice, "and why stories like ours need to be told." Helen and Father Thomas joined them, bringing Deborah and Clara. Together, that small group had achieved what previous generations had tried and failed to do: dismantle a conspiracy that seemed untouchable, bringing truth and justice to victims silenced for decades. As the last ray of sunlight disappeared on the horizon, Richard reflected on his journey. Born from a project that sought to control humanity through genetics, he had ended up using that same legacy to free people from that control. The irony didn't escape him. The Guardians had unwittingly created their own nemesis, the instrument of their own downfall. The future would continue to bring challenges. There were still branches of the conspiracy not fully exposed, powerful people trying to distance themselves from the scandal, victims who might never be identified. But for the first time in a long time, the scales seemed to tip in favor of truth and justice. "A toast," proposed Helen, raising her glass, "to everyone who kept the flame of truth alive even when it seemed impossible. And to those who will come after us," added Richard, "to ensure that stories like this never happen again." As the stars began to dot the sky, Richard felt a peace he hadn't known since the beginning of this journey. His life had been built on a lie, but now, finally, he could rebuild it on truth, a much stronger and more enduring foundation.